In the previous chapter, we talked about different government policies on the import side of the market. Specifically, we looked at import tariffs and quotas. In the next set of videos in this chapter, we're going to take a look at trade policy on the export side. And we're going to start off with export subsidies. So in this case, what we're talking about is a subsidy the government gives to domestic producers, but only on units of the good that they export. Okay, it's not a general production subsidy. We'll talk about general production subsidies in a little bit. So we're going to start off, as before, by looking at a small country scenario first. Okay. We'll start off with our small country, and then we'll move on to a large country analysis afterward. And want to pay attention to the different outcomes, because just like we had in the previous chapter with our tariff analysis, we're going to see that we get very different predictions depending on whether we're talking about a small country or a large country. Okay, so just as before, we're going to draw two graphs side by side. We'll put the domestic market here on the left side. And then we're going to put our world market, so we'll say this is home. And here's our world market over here. World or international market. Okay. So starting off, and we're going to draw our domestic supply and demand. So if we take the intersection right here between our supply and demand graphs, that gives us the autarky price. Right? So should be familiar with thinking in terms of this. Okay? So right here we're just depicting domestic market, the home country market with no trade, no interference, nothing going on. Now, before, when we were talking about import tariffs and quotas, we were focusing on the home country being the importer. Now we're focusing on a situation or a scenario where the home country is an exporter in this market. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the world price is going to be higher than this autarky price. So if you just draw this price straight over and label that PA, right, that's the domestic autarky price. Depending on what we have for a world price, that's going to determine the quantity of exports. And so if we had a price, let's say this is our world price right here, and then we would see our quantity supplied would be the point on the supply curve at that price, and our quantity demanded would be the point on the demand curve at that price. And our quantity of exports is the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at that world price. Okay? So we can draw our supply curve just like that. There's our export supply curve. Okay? Very similar, really analogous to how we derived the import demand curve from our domestic supply and demand curves for when the home country was an importer. Now again, we're talking about a small country assumption to start off with. So what does that mean for the demand, right? The import demand curve. Right? So again, think back to what we did before when we were talking about import tariffs. There, the home country was the importer, right? And now they're the exporter. So before, when they were the importer, we had derived a downward sloping import demand curve, but the export supply curve was a horizontal line because the home country was a price taker. Well, likewise, again here, what we're going to see is that the home country is a price taker, but now it's on the export market. So really what we're saying is that home country producers can export as much as they want at this world price. Okay? Doesn't matter what we do in the home country, we will not affect the world price. So we show the import demand curve as a horizontal line. And so this is our basic setup. So how do we go ahead and analyze our, our tariff effect here? Okay, so if we start off, note what we have here, right? We have initially at the world prices, we would have our quantity supplied here, label that QS0, and our quantity demanded here, label that QD0, and of course that distance between the two, QS0 minus QD0, that is our exports at the world price of PW. Okay? Now, how are we going to illustrate the export subsidy? Now, what's important to note, and again, this is an export subsidy, not a general production subsidy. So the domestic producers are only going to get the subsidy if they export the units of the good. So it's going to create a possible issue for us here in the domestic market. So let's say if you're a producer and say the world price is $100, but the government's going to give you a $10 subsidy for every unit of the good you export. So if you sell your product on the world market, you'll get the world price of 100 plus another 10 from the government. So you'd get 110. But what if you sell your good domestically? Well, in that case, you're only going to get the $100, which is the world price. So domestic producers would have no incentive to supply the domestic market, which is why in practice what you often see is that governments will combine an export subsidy with a tariff on imports, right? So that in the tariff we would make it equivalent, make it $10, so that would raise the domestic price up to 110 as well, okay? So that the world price is 100, domestic price would be 110, domestic producers who are exporting would get 110 selling either domestically or internationally. Okay? So that's really how you want to think about this. It's export subsidy combined with an equivalent tariff to make the domestic price the same as the price the exporters will receive with the subsidy when they do export, right? The domestic producers will receive. What happens anytime we subsidize production? Well, that's going to shift our supply curve out, right? Remember, you want to think about the supply curve as the marginal cost curve. When you had a subsidy in place, that's offsetting some of your costs. So we can shift our supply curve out. Here's our supply curve, export supply curve with the subsidy S. And now what's going to happen here? So we'll go from having our initial exports at 0. They would increase now to X1. And again, we're still dealing with this world price. Now the question is, well, where does that increase in exports come from? We're going to see it in two places. Now, remember, the domestic price is going to go up from this world price here to a new world price, right, of 100 and, in this case, 10 if you use the numbers I just gave in that example. So in this case, right, here's the world price plus the subsidy. So we're going to notice two effects here. First, if you look on the demand curve, right, the price has increased. So consumers are going to want to buy less. Right? So we'll see a decrease in consumption. At the same time, we're going to see an increase in production because the price has gone up for the domestic producers. So if we look at this now, we want to do the same thing we did in the previous chapter, and we want to track the changes in surplus. So what is the change in the, start with consumers. What's the change in consumer surplus? Now remember, before, right, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve down to the price, which was PW, and out to the quantity consumed. So initially, that would have been this whole triangle in here. But now, what are we going to be left with? Well, now, we're going to only be left with this upper triangle here. As the price increases to PW plus S, right, consumers are going to lose this rectangle A, because while they continue to consume QD up to QD1, they're paying a higher price for each unit of the good. They're also going to lose B, because they're no longer consuming the units of the good between QD1 and QD0. So overall, consumer surplus falls by A and B. What about our producer surplus? Remember that producer surplus is the area above the supply curve up to the price received, right? Again, think of the supply curve as reflecting your marginal cost of production. It's the difference between the price you're receiving and the cost of producing that last unit of the good. Well, initially, producer surplus is this triangular area here down below PW. Now when the price goes up to BW plus S with the subsidy, the producers are gaining A, B, and this area in here, which is between the demand and supply curves and PW plus S, that area is C. Okay? So they're gaining A, B, and C. So it's this kind of trapezoidal area here. So far, this looks good from a domestic perspective, because the increase in the producer surplus is actually much larger than the increase in the decrease in the consumer surplus. But again, you've got to track the third group here, which is the government revenue. And so here we want to pay particular attention to what is the cost? What is the cost of this program? Well, the government is paying the subsidy S on each unit of the good that's being exported. And what is our new level of exports? Well, our new level of exports is QS1 minus QD1. And so those are the exports at PW plus S, right? World price with the subsidy. And so where is that? Well, here is our new level of consumption. Here's our new level of production. So this rectangle here, highlighting in the green, that's the total subsidy cost. I'm going to add in here, label that triangle D. So our total subsidy cost, and this is a negative because the government's paying it out, is B, C, and D. So what is our net effect? Well, A and B cancel each other out because A and B is just a transfer from consumers to producers. And C also, the C's cancel out because that is a transfer from, you could say the government, but really we're talking about taxpayer funds, right? So it's a transfer from the households, from the taxpayers, because that is where the government, right, it's got to raise the revenue to somehow pay for this subsidy. So it's a tax on households or other businesses alternatively. But that's tax revenue the government's raising from other economic agents in the country. And so that's really just a transfer from the taxpayers to the producers, to the exporters. What we're left with is a net loss of B and D. And B, what's going on B? Why are we losing B? Well, B is coming, right, that's the part of the loss of consumer surplus that in the end isn't being completely offset because we're actually tracking it here twice. That's our consumption loss or consumption distortion. It's coming from the fact that we're no longer consuming the optimal quantity, right? We're consuming less than we should have because the subsidy combined with the import tariff is actually raising the domestic price. And D is our production loss. It's coming from the fact that we're producing too much. And what do we mean by too much? Again, look at the supply curve. On these units between QS0 and QS1, right? What we're actually selling the price for is PW, right? We're selling the good for PW at that price. But the marginal cost of production is actually higher than the price that our domestic producers are receiving out on the world market. The reason they're willing to supply them is because the government's then giving them the subsidy as an additional incentive to produce. Okay? So that's why we're overproducing and getting this production loss. So overall, the net loss for the home country, right, this is a small country with an export subsidy, is B and D. And very similar, actually, to the analysis we did before. Next, we're going to turn our attention to looking at an export subsidy with a large country analysis.